All right, welcome to Our Experience, ASCP's podcast. I'm your host, Chad Wurz, and next to me is Tom Hansel, and we are very excited today to have Ben Link with us. Ben was our keynote speaker at our annual meeting in Denver this past November, and he's a pharmacist, and welcome to the show, Ben.
Thanks for having me. Happy to be here.
So give our listeners an idea of who Ben is. I know you're a pharmacist. How did that come to be? And then how did you get all the way to your current position with Access Advisors?
Sure. So I'm a kid who knew I wanted to be a pharmacist since 7th grade. My mom was the overbearing type. I love you, Mom. But she had us all go around and interview all of our relatives for what they did for a living and start to think about what we wanted to do for a living. And my aunt, who's a doctor, said if she could do it all over again, she would have been a pharmacologist. She would have developed drugs. And that led me down the thought of pharmacy, and I just didn't change my mind from 7th grade on. Now, being so, I guess, motivated or directed, whichever word you want to use, as soon as I turned 18, I started as a pharmacy technician. I thought I would do the retail pharmacy thing my whole life. So when I went to school to get a Spanish minor so that I could, better interact with some aspects of the community where I live. And over the course of my schooling, retail pharmacy wasn't what I thought it would be. I got exposed through, the good thing that schooling's supposed to do to other forms of what it could look like to be a pharmacist. And ultimately that led me shortly after graduating to a small PBM where I started to do reports on patients and helped with what they had at the time, an opioid defense manager program. It was a workers' comp related PBM. And then from there, I just kind of moved from that to the Ohio Medicaid program, the vendor for them. And ultimately, that led me to different experiences and exposure to the point where I, became a pharmacist fed up with fake, artificially inflated drug prices. And that, of course, led me into Antonio's arms and, 3 Access Advisors and 46 Brooklyn and all that. So that's the medium-sized version of why Ben Link is a pharmacist and here on your podcast.
That's awesome. I want you to talk a little bit more about like when you were working for, and I don't know if it was the small PBM or Ohio Medicaid, what were you seeing that made you say, hey, wait, like it's almost like you're a whistleblower. You're seeing things and you run into Antonio's arms. I like that. But like, what were you seeing that you were like, wow, this is really messed up?
So I think it actually started in the retail pharmacy experience. I can remember very much the moment that drug pricing really came to the forefront of my mind. And that was as an intern helping a little old lady and her son try to get some ondansetron filled. Now, this was when it had just recently gone generic and it was still a gazillion dollars. I mean, there are still areas where it's a gazillion dollars, right? But her insurance didn't want to cover it for whatever reason. Newly diagnosed cancer patient, doesn't need this powerful anti-nausea med. And, I was trying to find a place for her to get it cheaper. Ultimately ended up at Costco. And the Costco pharmacist berated me. He said, how could your Kroger pharmacy be charging so much for this medication? Why is your cash price so high effectively? And so that was when I started paying more attention to it. And then ultimately, I've never stopped paying attention to it, I guess. But that leads to the question about like, what is our cash pricing? What is our purchase pricing? I mean, the pharmacies that I worked at least were pretty good at exposing or letting you see those kind of numbers. Some pharmacies and their systems, you don't know what your acquisition cost actually is. That's something that corporate knows. And so, ultimately, I had a pretty good knack for data and analysis. And, ultimately, that's what I think helped to get me the first PBM job. And then that also helped to get me the Medicaid job, because one of the things I was doing at the small PBM was running their drug utilization review interventions. So we had lettering campaigns back then where we'd send doctors a note and say, hey, did you know you're prescribing X when you could do Y or whatever. And I tracked all of the success rates of those various letters, reported them to not only our clients, but in the aggregate. And I used that experience to make the letters hopefully better. I remember, one of the first ones that I created was a Lyrica intervention, trying to be like, this is 3 or 2 a day dosing, and it all costs the same. At least that's what our pricing logic was. And so if I can convince you to take a higher strength twice per day as opposed to the lower strength 3 times a day, I can cut your costs, by a third. So probably a longer answer than maybe you were looking for, but
no, it's great. Why do you think it is? And I'm going to go back in my pharmacy history. I worked at a independent community pharmacy, and then in PharmD school they got bought by CVS, and then I worked for Kroger for a couple years until I got out of PharmD school and went into long-term care. But, I remember the days of like running a report at the end of the day to see which scripts you lost money on and to make sure that you billed the right NDC number. And, just the idea of that, and the idea that pharmacy somehow has lost control. I can't speak for the grocery business because I never worked it, but I have to believe there are very few business models where it's sort of well known that you're going to lose money on a certain number of the products that you sell. I think everybody's like, no, we may make less, but
right.
We're gonna entice you in with a low price on a product, but we don't commonly lose money every time we sell something. How did pharmacy get in this space?
That's a very interesting question. And again, it is difficult to find parallels in my experience of other industries that look the way that pharmacy does. It's not to necessarily say that pharmacy is entirely unique in this regard, but it is a small circle, right? It's not as wide as I think. And, like you said, when you try to have these conversations with folks who aren't as familiar with it, they don't understand what you mean by it. And so in my view, I think the kind of the original sin, so to speak, of pharmacy was average wholesale price, AWP. So if you go back far enough in time, there have always been drug prices, right? We have cuneiform tablets from way back when that talk about, certain medicinal herbs having a price to them, right? What changed is it went from a thing where, you were buying those directly or buying them through your provider, whether that was a doctor or pharmacist, to one where an insurer, some third party, wanted to help you pay for that thing. And in order to help you pay for that thing, especially before, the information age where we could communicate things in near real time, we had to kind of know what your price was in advance. And so, the first drug pricing benchmark that we made was AWP, and it was made by a California Medicaid pharmacist effectively calling up his buddies and saying, hey, if we're going to help pay for these drugs for 4 people, what would we have to pay you to do this, right? And I have no idea. I cannot find. I would love to know. If any of your listeners know, they would be my hero. What the history of AWP switching from effectively a state-run pricing benchmark via the California Medicaid program to something that was privately owned and managed through, the Physician's Red Book or First Data Bank or whatever have you. I cannot find that piece of history. The best I found is references to some historic OIG audits that are housed in like the state library of New Mexico and Oklahoma, and I just haven't made it out there yet to go actually request to see the original documents, but they're not digitized. But anyways, when AWP was created and it became the prevailing pricing benchmark, we know because of an OIG audit that by the late 80s, 100% of Medicaid claims, and therefore most claims broadly, were being reimbursed at 100% of AWP as the reimbursement mechanism. And so is it any wonder during this time, if you know anything about AWP, I'll drop the shoe in a little bit, but if you already know, you know where this is going, that pharmacy grew rapidly during that time. Grocery stores started having pharmacies in them. It was good, big business. There was a drugstore on every corner. And so eventually the OIG investigated like, hey, what is this pricing benchmark? How good is it? And it found that it was not necessarily representative of pharmacy cost, right? And the finding was so surprising in 1985 that they had to redo the study. And by 1989, we were sure that not only was AWP not a price that represented the drug's price, but it inflated between the 2 years already, or the few years already. And so that led to a guidance that said we can no longer pay drugs on an AWP basis. We must use something called estimated acquisition cost, which effectively became discounting. And it's that discounting that leads to this problem that you describe of where some drugs get so discounted that they're actually sold at a loss. And it creates a lot of disparities and inequalities within our reimbursement system, because there's not going to be a universal approach to what that discounting looks like. And that has associated with it a great deal of harms. The example that I use to try to best articulate it is, imagine if we applied what we know about drug pricing to like buying a truck, right? A truck is a pretty, reasonable, I think, commodity. You get your Ford F-150 or your, Toyota or your Tundra or whatever, your Dodge Ram. If you think about like, what does it look like trying to secure a truck at a drug discounting price? You're saying like, hey, this is $1 million truck, but don't worry, I'm going to get an 85% discount on it. I'm going to get a 90% discount on it. That sounds insane. If I tried to tell my wife, like, I'm going to buy this $1 million car, but I've negotiated a sweet discount on it, she would lose it, right? And every percent that I was off on that negotiation would be a lot more money than the reality we have today, where it's just a lower price.
Yeah, it's you talk about AWP being the original sin. I look at when you talked about the growth of pharmacy and putting the pharmacy in the back of the big box store or the back of the grocery as the exacerbation, I guess, of that original sin. Because at the end of the day, you had businesses, groceries, Target, Walmart, not caring about the pharmacy. The pharmacy was a carrot. I don't care if I lose money on the pharmacy, because you're spending, I think Target had you spent something like $400 or something like that when you walked in and out of a Target to get a prescription. So they didn't care. They're like, you're buying all the high volume, high profit items, CDs at the time, like whatever. And they didn't care. And I think that hurt, obviously, small pharmacies that don't have a big box or a grocery concept. It hurt long-term care pharmacies that don't have any sort of out-front or retail component to their business. And it really drove, you can't go back. You can't go back and say, oh, hey, wait, we were losing money, so your contract doesn't work for us anymore. Now that we're not a big box store, or that we're not a pharmacy that has an out-front. Like, you can't go back.
Yeah, if I can latch onto that real too. I fully agree, because when you think about that effect, right? In some ways, right, when those grocery store or in-store pharmacies started to develop, right, it was taking pricing decisions away from pharmacy as a profession, right? And it was putting it under corporate, right? Whatever that was, whether it was a grocery chain or whatever. But furthermore, like you said, if it was an aggregate, low profit or even, sometimes a loss leader or whatever, right? Well, what happens when times get bad? It doesn't matter how big your business is. Sometimes there will be economic headwinds. And what are you going to do? You're going to look at your balance sheet and say, that's the underperforming thing. Let me sell that off. Let me get rid of that. Even though you only made it that way as part of a grander bargain, right?
Right.
But now you're gonna look at it, well, I gotta trim some fat or whatever. It's like, well, no, it's only that way because of your grand designs to begin with, right? And it's the same thing with these like larger pharmacy chains. Like I truthfully wonder if you're a pharmacy chain that spans the country and you start announcing these store closings, right? Like if you have a national contract with a big PBM, right? Your aggregate experience is still your aggregate experience, even if it's under smaller number of stores, right? Like you don't control necessarily, or it doesn't seem on the outside that you would control your own destiny, so to speak, by doing that. And especially when you consider the leverage you're losing having less purchasers on the acquisition side, you're not going to buy as much if you have fewer stores. It is curious of an approach to how to manage the problem.
It all becomes pricing. Volume. It all becomes volume. Like we're pursuing as much volume as we can get. Mail order pharmacies about volume. These big chains are about volume because that's the only way they can overcome their losses. or at least in their head, that's the only way they can overcome their losses, if they get the right mix of high volume. And it puts everybody, patients as part of this in a negative environment, because you have pharmacists trying to fill 1,000 scripts a day. You have physicians trying to see, 50 people an hour. I mean, this volume-driven concept in healthcare is detrimental to healthcare itself.
Well, and I don't think companies like Walmart, CVS, Walgreens mind if the small independent pharmacies struggle. And so that's to their advantage in some ways, and
But they're finding out that this pursuit of volume is the law of diminishing returns.
Right.
They're becoming
race to the bottom.
They're becoming the change bank from Saturday Night Live.
So Ben, tell us about your initial interactions and meeting of Antonio and Eric and what's now 46 Brooklyn and 3 Axis. Kind of how did that first kick off, and how did you guys first meet?
Sure, yeah. So, I met them before those things were even things, right? So during my time at the Ohio Medicaid, I was with Change Healthcare. We were the vendor to the Ohio Medicaid fee-for-service program. But as the clinical account manager, I had responsibility for not only the prior authorization and the adjudication system and the pricing that we were doing on the fee-for-service side of Medicaid, but I also had obligations under the contract to do global pharmacy reporting for the state. So that meant also checking in on the managed care reimbursements and practices and the rebates and all that other stuff. And so over the course of my time with Change Healthcare working for the Ohio Medicaid program, there was many concerns raised about the practices of managed Medicaid in our state. They were reimbursement concerns. There were concerns about prior authorizations, those kinds of things. And so there was meetings set up with various stakeholders. I think, technically speaking, my first interaction was probably in the month or so before go live, when we were doing some testings on our system statewide. But most of it was in these meetings where the state was trying to answer questions from interested parties, of which Ohio Pharmacists Association was one, and Antonio was, at Ohio Pharmacists Association at that time. And over the course of those meetings, eventually it became, conversations outside of those meetings that led to, kind of, again, data guy, right? I was telling them, like, some of the questions that you're asking or seeking answers to, like, there is public data to answer these questions. You can take CMS's state drug utilization data, and you could take CMS's NADAC data, and you can put those two data sets together, and you can start to see what does profitability look like across the state. And ultimately that led to some of their first dashboards, which, they shared and showed to some media folks, and then the rest is, so to speak, history. They started doing that, got enough traction doing that they could hire an employee. And so outside of them, I was, employee number one at 3 Axis. And the rest is, so to speak, history.
So what is the most egregious things that you got to experience, whether you were at Change or at 3 Axis? Can you tell our listeners maybe a couple good stories of kind of the most egregious PBM actions that you've seen, that you've been able to witness?
I can do my best. I think that sometimes we get a little set in our ways and we say, well, this is the way it's kind of always been, and we don't do as good of a job of asking outside questions, right? And so if you look at, like, the charges that health plans receive for prior authorization services, whether those are a managed Medicaid program or anywhere else, right? In general, those can be like $50 to $100 per PA if it has to, touch either a technician or a pharmacist or a doctor or whatever, right? If you start working backwards, right, as from the math standpoint, right, like, you might pay a prior authorization pharmacist, $60 an hour to sit there and do these PA verifications. So you're effectively paying for each event the full hourly salary. And it's very quickly to do the math and be like, this seems crazy. There's no way that this is a sort of basis of cost for charging these things, right? And then that cascades into other things, right? If you're a program receiving either capitated rates, that administration of that prior authorization becomes money that we all have to pay for, even if it's not necessarily or doesn't seem based in logical fact, right? And it just cascades from there. So on the drug pricing side, we see a lot of the specialty generics, which we've been talking about since effectively day one at 46 Brooklyn. So the very first report on 46 Brooklyn was the cancerous design of the U.S. healthcare system. It talked about a drug called imatinib, generic Gleevec. And it said, insurers across the country are being charged $5,000 for this product that would seem to cost much less than that. I want to say at the time, the NADAC cost was around $200. It's since come down to like $75, but at the time, I think it was, still over a tenfold difference between what the charges we were seeing versus what the cost was. And we have been talking about imatinib every basically report from now until then. And it's still a drug that is associated with immense markets. And you had the FTC recently released their second interim report on PBMs that talked about a whole list of similar drugs. And it's always been curious to me how this has been talked about and held up as an example, and yet they're not willing to let it go, right? It's not changed. You think you could score, so to speak, an easy W if you just let go of these insane markups on this drug, and they don't. And the FTC said some light perhaps on why that. These affiliated PBM-owned pharmacies are making a ton of money on this, such that the report estimates like it's something like 12% of their operating income is coming from these 50 or so drugs that they're marking up. And so again, that's speaking to the disparate nature of pricing. It's speaking to some of the harms that come through leveraged negotiation, right? No one, I think, would willingly sign a contract that says, I want to play cost plus $5,000. Like, sign me up. That's the one I want to negotiate, right? But you might sign a contract that says, I want AWP minus 18%. When the real answer is AWP minus 20% or whatever would be the thing. Is that it's that percentage being a lot of value, just like I talked about with the truck, where you don't perceive like, 2%, what does 2% mean? I can take or leave 2%, but it's everything in the kind of leveraged world. And the next thing, you kind of mentioned it a little bit, when you talked about the patient aspect. A leveraged world doesn't care necessarily, or doesn't do a good job of deciding which patients win or lose, right? Some patients will get good, affordable imatinib prescription prices, but many will not, because it's a leverage system that says, well, this is one of the ones where it doesn't happen. And it could flip tomorrow, right? Mm-hmm. Even though we've been talking about it for 6 years now, it could flip tomorrow, and it would be somebody else's drug that's now being, taken advantage of.
All right, so I have a couple of global questions that I'm sure you have an opinion on. Hopefully you can give some insight. First off, the PBM reform that is currently in Congress, is this a major win if it passes?
So I think it very much depends upon what the final language looks like and how it is ultimately implemented. I think that the larger challenge I see with deciding whether things are wins or losses is we have not done a good job deciding what we want drug prices to do. And from a certain point of view, you could argue that the system is incredibly successful as designed today because it makes the United States the preeminent capital of drug innovation, right? And so if we're okay paying $1 million for gene therapy or whatever, we will continue to probably develop the cutting edge technology of what medicine can do. And I think, COVID is a good example recently of that. Many countries developed COVID vaccines. The most preferred vaccines were those developed in the United States, right? And so again, by some measures, if you're just interested in innovation, you might say, don't touch the system. That's certainly what pharma seems to advocate, right? Don't touch the system, let it go, and we'll continue to innovate and make really interesting things. But again, providers seem to be being left behind in the system today. Patients seem to be being left behind in the system as designed today. But it's going to be really hard to decide whether it is a success or not until we decide what we want drug pricing to do. And so if we want drug pricing to enable vast amounts of innovation, then perhaps no, this won't be successful. If we want drug pricing to give a fairer shake to patients and providers, then we should probably change some things. And this legislation is, again, depending upon what the final version looks like, perhaps a step in the right direction towards those goals.
So maybe related to that, I'm probably going to be biased here in my statement, but I can see what a pharmaceutical company can innovate and create for healthcare. Obviously, they are the ones that come up with drugs that could have a meaningful impact on a disease condition or a problem. I can see how pharmacists, when they are dispensing medications or communicating with patients, can have a profound impact on that individual's quality, because they can do the kinds of things to make sure that that person's medication regimen is effective and efficient and is working for them. I don't see so much where the PBMs and the insurers play a significant role. Now, obviously they do. I get it. But is part of this, do you see in the future part of this saying, hey, we're giving the lion's share of profits to these PBMs, insurers, and they're not really returning much value to us? Whereas if the pharmaceutical companies, and I know this is going to sound like heresy, either maintain some revenue or get a little more, they're going to generate things. And if pharmacy gets a little more, they're going to generate things that ultimately improve the healthcare of the average person in America. I mean, is that a fair statement? Is that incredibly biased? Is that a future we can think about?
I think you did a good job, Chad. You're selling yourself short. I think that again, it's to me, it's asking the right kind of questions, right? The problem with an AWP discount-based thing is we stuff basically everything into the drugs cost, and it makes value assessment very hard, right? The PBM makes money off of the drug cost, differential pricing between the network and their plan sponsors, the ability to charge a percentage of drug prices and rebates and withhold amounts, whatever, right? Pharmacy makes money off of the AWP-based discount. The contracts you see out there, they're not paying you more than $1 if you're lucky in dispensing fee. So it's all the cost is located into the drugs ingredient costs, right? So when you've stuffed all the value into the drugs ingredient costs, it becomes very difficult to make the value assessment of where that proportionality is going from. Again, that idea of you wouldn't pay cost plus $5,000 for a drug. You wouldn't sign that contract, right? But when it's all jammed in, it's much more difficult. I tend to agree that under the paradigm as it exists now, if you were to try to assess value of component parts, like again, imagine you could wipe the healthcare slate clean and start over. I do think the first thing you grab is drugs, right? And again, maybe it's biased of a pharmacist, but if I had to restart the healthcare system and say, I don't want to lose this, right? Because if I lost drugs, right? People die from strep throat again. People can't really get those kinds of surgeries they did because we don't have the vasoconstrictors, the blood pressure control medicines. Right. People get strokes. All these things is lost by not having medicine. So I grab medicines first, right? On my bingo or on my Ouija board or whatever. I'm taking that first. And what are you going to put around drugs? I think the healthcare system, at least the education I got, is you put pharmacists around drugs, right? They're the drug experts. I think hopefully doctors would give that to us, right?
Sure.
And so again, like you said, the value chain becomes, well, what is the value of the insurer? And I would say that part of the reason why this has been difficult, changes have been difficult, is one of the principal, if not the principal function of PBMs today is I know the price, right? I'm the one who's managed the network to secure those leverage-based discounts. And if you don't have me, what are you going to use? I'm the one who knows. If you look at their financial statements, their 10K statements, basically all the big insurer PBMs, all of them, they say have something in there that if AWP goes away, our ability to return value to our shareholders is at risk, right? Believe them when they tell you that. That is effectively a sworn financial statement. Believe them when they say that a lot of our value is derived from, quote unquote, knowing what things cost. And then the question becomes, well, do they know what things cost? How good of a job are they at knowing? MAC lists are a great example in my mind, right? I think if you were to wipe the slate clean and redesign MAC rates, right, the goal should be transparency. I should want to tell you, go buy it over there because it's cheaper. You'll save money buying it over there, and I'll save money because I justified why it would be over there. But instead, they're not. Every state that's tried to pass MAC transparency or whatever sort of laws have faced a lot of resistance. You can't know how our prices work. They're not for you to know. And again, I think some of that goes back to their kind of financial statements to say, we think this is of great value to us.
Yeah, I think like the Inflation Reduction Act and the way it was written clearly shows that the government doesn't know or doesn't understand actually where the money's at. So to your point, it was a attack pharma kind of policy. And, you know, pharmacists and pharmacies are on the downfall of that. And if you go back and kind of look to see what the outcome's going to be, you know, I saw in three axis, you guys put a report out, says unpacking the financial impacts of the Medicare drug price negotiation analysis on pharmacy cash flow. And here in this article, you guys talk about being a double-edged sword. But to your point earlier is it was we're gonna stick it to pharma is what IRA comes out and we're gonna help the patients, but the PBMs, nothing's going to change for their profit margins. And so that clearly tells me that the government doesn't understand that. But, you know, Ben, you want to talk a little bit about that article that 3Axis just put out and why it's a double-edged sword for pharmacies?
Sure. So, you know, a lot of that article or that analysis, as all analysis are predicated upon what we know and what we have to assume, right? What we know is that drug pricing contracts, pharmacy network contracts, do not really provide value outside of the drug's cost, right? I've not seen any contracts that envision, you know, a carve out for these drugs and special, you know, extra dispensing fees of that. So effectively, any money that's being made on these drugs today is by design of the IRA going to get sucked out of the system, right? A maximum fair price as negotiated and conceived within the program is effectively a ceiling on reimbursement that is going to really just make the manufacturer, you know, whole, so to speak, on what their typical list price to net price shenanigans are. We're going to just put those all at the point of sale. And, you know, again, in doing so, using the leverage of the entirety of Medicare as opposed to the hodgepodge of all the plans, we got a better deal because, again, it's leverage, right? I represent, you know, 50 million lives as opposed to, you know, the 1 million lives I might represent on my own or whatever. And so pharmacy, as you can see from what I'm describing, wasn't in the conversation or doesn't appear to have been at the table for what this is going to actually look like in effect, right? As we say in that report, if manufacturers respond to having to use this transaction facilitator and use this payment mechanism by just lowering their WAC price, right? This isn't really a thing, right? But as it stands right now, pharmacies are going to buy the drug at a high WAC price, get reimbursed a price approximately 60% below that WAC price, and then wait for the money to come in, right? In a way that's different from the way that they already wait for the money to come in. And oh, by the way, if there was any historic reimbursement where they were making money on these drugs, that goes away too, because again, we flattened it out. We didn't leave any. We didn't pay for any of our savings in the price negotiation by ensuring that these drugs also had to have a corresponding, you know, dispensing fee. Again, this is effectively actual acquisition cost, right? And what we know about actual acquisition cost reimbursement as opposed to our AWP discounts is the dispensing fee becomes the key value piece for the provider, right? If you were to take every payment contract out there that exists today and make it just pay NADAC, all payers would save money, 100%. I have great confidence, right? Because NADAC isn't meant to be used by itself. It's supposed to be NADAC plus something for the provider, plus something even for the PBM, right? They're going to need an admin fee to run this thing because they don't get to take their money out of the ingredient cost. So that's in essence what that study is trying to show. It's trying to show if we just put the cards on the table, so to speak, show our math, we see that this is harmful to pharmacies in the aggregate. That doesn't mean that there aren't pharmacies that might benefit from this because they're on the low end of the leverage thing. We have a sensitivity analysis in there where we try to show that. The range can be quite huge of an individual pharmacy experience, but in the aggregate, pharmacy net would appear to lose under this system.
So I have a couple questions on IRA. Just some, as we explore this from a long-term care pharmacy perspective, I feel like this transactional relationship that will be built between an individual pharmacy and a pharmacy manufacturer is a potential opportunity. Like prior to today, you got paid by the plan, the PBM. Now you're going to get paid by the plan, and you're effectively going to get money from the pharmaceutical company in a way that we've never shared transactions before with pharmaceutical companies. They're going to get some data transaction information from the data module, the federal data module, whatever they're calling it. Nothing says that manufacturer can't pay more than WAC minus the manufactured price. They could pay a fee. They could give, I don't want to use the word rebate, but they could give additional payment if maybe your pharmacy positions their product. Is that a reasonable thing to start talking about? And I'll add to it. I had done some presentations last year where I was talking about, effectively like Eliquis. And we used VA pricing as a predictor for what it might look like when IRA prices came out. And for the most part, we were wrong. They were a little bit lower than VA prices. It wasn't bad, but it was close. I think it was a fair argument. But Eliquis, the manufacturer negotiated price is better than the VA price. The VA price is much lower, which tells me that there's might be room in that manufacturer negotiated price for more than just that WAC minus price rebate that you're getting from the manufacturer. And wouldn't the manufacturer be more inclined to be friends with the pharmacy as opposed to friends with the plan? And is that a way that, hey, yeah, the plan is going to get the bare bones of these products based on that manufacturer negotiated price, but the pharmacies and the manufacturer might be able to build a relationship, and maybe that results in more money.
I think it's a definite possibility. I mean, I think, again, what are manufacturer rebates and discounts designed to do? What is the thing of value that manufacturers get? And they get volume, right? I don't think that's a controversial statement, right?
Right.
I give rebates to secure formulary placement. In some ways, it's a very good deal for manufacturers because it gives them what appears to be legal ways to maybe even, disparage their competition, right? If I give a contract that says I want one of one preferred position, right? I'm not saying you have to disparage my competitors. I'm just saying I'm first in line, right? Which has a connotation of there's people behind me. But I'm not saying that there necessarily has to be, right? But yeah, I digress. I think that the challenge for pharmacy historically has been, it's been viewed that the plans have all the power in that the formulary is the thing that drives those wheels. And so until pharmacy is able to demonstrate that they can, make a difference, so to speak, in that, or provide value that's perhaps different than that, right? Maybe it's not that I'm growing your volume, but maybe it's I'm ensuring that they stay on the therapy, right? What is going on with GLP-1s right now? There's a lot of research out there saying that, well, people might try these, but a good number of them aren't sticking on them, right? So is there an intervention where I can show I'm making sure that your patients are staying on these therapy and thereby growing your volume through adherence or whatever, right? So it'll be interesting to see what people try to innovate in this space. And I be honest, I hadn't necessarily thought that way, Chad, but you're right. Once you've created the bridge, building the bridge is the hardest thing. Now you can start moving different kinds of trucks across the bridge, right?
Well, I don't want to I don't want to get too provocative, but like the other thing I thought about was if you're sharing transactions with that data module and the plan is verifying that they're Medicare transactions so that the pharmaceutical company can pay the rebate on a confident transaction, couldn't you share, if you're a long-term care pharmacy, couldn't you share your Part A transactions? Now, they may not go to the plan, but they could go to the pharmaceutical company, and those are very valuable transactions for that pharmaceutical company to have confidence in. Take it a step further to 340B. If you're a pharmacy that doesn't participate in 340B, does that sharing of those transactions with that company make them feel more confident in you as a pharmacy? Because now I'm not looking at transactions where I don't really know if you use that 340B product, for the wrong claim. And I don't like 340B because of that. Now you're giving a sense of transparency to the pharmaceutical company about your own transactions, and maybe that makes them more confident in you as a provider.
As someone who spends their day with data, yes, I think there's a lot of value in data and a lot of value in what you can potentially offer in sharing data to those who are interested in it.
Yeah, for sure.
Ultimately, I think we need to turn Elon and Vivek loose on the PBMs.
Yeah, right.
We'll have a Doge for PBMs.
I mean, I do think, just as an aside of two, like sort of off-topic questions. One is, what should, this is really a wild question for you, Ben. I don't know that you'll be able to answer it. But when you look at this new administration and their pursuit of deregulation, are there things pharmacy as a profession should be looking at to say, hey, take these regulations away, because ultimately that helps our business. Maybe we spend less labor because of some of these regulations. Maybe we don't get a pay increase, but we get an expense decrease in having to perform in some of these regulations that might be antiquated or just busy work. Are there any that come to the top of your head?
Yeah, nothing that comes to my top of mind.
I can think of something. Not letting PBMs audit us. We spend a lot of hours having to prove what we dispensed, and that takes a lot of money.
I don't know if that's a regulation.
But they're throwing all those audits at us. I mean, that's something that, again, pharmacists not so much are regulated as their customers, the nursing homes are. But if there's any kind of limits on audits that's coming from PBMs, I think that would be a huge help.
I know that when I worked in a long-term care pharmacy, our biggest cost center was our management of Schedule II narcotics. Now, I know that we're touching a third rail if we say, can we back down some of the regulations from the DEA? But maybe there are some that make sense that would relieve some of that pressure. I mean, we track and obviously for good reasons all of those medications, but is it too onerous of a burden? I don't know. There's just different things to think about. And while we're doing grab bag, well, go ahead.
I was going to say, to that point, again, it wasn't that long ago. People like to think it was always that way. But, the Controlled Substance Acts of 1970, right, that's where quantity limits on what drug manufacturers could effectively buy to make the product, right? That creates an artificial ceiling on effectively supply, which, again, was a desirable effect to try to deal with diversion, but it does increase the prices of all of those things, right? If they could get unlimited kind of supplies of that, right, you would probably see those prices go down, right? Because one of the things that unfortunately happens sometimes is a manufacturer sits on their allocation, right? I allocated you a third of all the amphetamine to make ADHD pills. Well, my manufacturing plant is down right now because of maintenance or a hurricane or whatever it was, right? That creates a supply crunch that wouldn't exist. So I can see where you're going with that. And in today's age with state PDMP reporting and things like that, do you need that huge government tool of limited purchasing power there? Maybe you don't. I haven't given enough thought to agree with you, but I can see where you're going with that, Chad.
All right. My next grab bag question. You worked for Change Healthcare, so I have to ask the obvious question. Like, what do you make of their security breach? And I think maybe more important, and I've been saying this since the day it happened, where's the penalty for this? Like, if this were a pharmacy, if I was an independent pharmacy and I had a security breach like this, I can see having all of my managed care contracts canceled and effectively putting me out of business, but somehow
Being Optum. It was only
Are we going to get penalized? Are they going to get penalized?
Million.
Right?
You're saying rules for thee, but not for me? Is that what you're saying? I think so. I'm going to steal Antonio's joke. Antonio's joke, so, well, he likes to say, you saw what happened to Change Healthcare when Ben left. So, just saying.
Right?
But,
right.
Yeah. But I think, to me, it does several things, right? To those who say that the market isn't as consolidated as you want to believe. I mean, there's the Dr. Carlton report in response to the FTC stuff that says, the big three are not the big three. This is not the great and powerful Oz, right? Well, it's a pretty obvious demonstration of what consolidation potentially looks like if this one piece of this conglomerate can knock out so much functionality across the marketplace, right? That's kind of proof point number one to point. How do you explain that?
Right.
If you think that that's really not as consolidated as you think, and then to your second point of your question, right? I think that I have no idea what is going on behind the scenes vis-a-vis, penalties or otherwise, right? And you're right. I think that if this were to happen on a smaller scale, it would be almost, a death bell to anyone that was smaller than this. But again, in some ways, it's the kind of catch-22 of, well, are they, quote unquote, too big to fail like a bank, right? If I throw a hammer at them, what else might I break
Right.
that I don't necessarily know or understand? And that's a big unknown.
And maybe that's the better question. Are we too, we have three effective insurers. Like, are we too consolidated? We don't really have competition at that level. We're almost a single payer system. We have basically four payers. I mean, in a way, three. Is that part of the problem?
Yeah, I mean, again, I'm a pharmacist, I'm not an economist or whatever, but, from what I understand, there's many economists that say that, when a market is mature, it's going to tend to oligopoly just kind of anyways, right? Like it just tends to be what happens. It becomes that way. Now, again, they hand wave and say that that's okay, but I think there's a question there of like the practical implications of that, right? Well, maybe when things skew that way, maybe it's a sign that there needs to be some sort of intervention regulation where it becomes a utility, so to speak, right? If switching companies are going to skew to an oligopoly because we want everyone to be connected, this is the information age after all, right? Well, maybe there's an argument that gets made that, well, owning the bridge infrastructure becomes a public good, not a private toll system, right?
Right.
And those are questions that again go towards back to that. Like, what do you want this thing to do? What do you want drug pricing to accomplish? If we all have to pay for things, right? Do we really want toll bridges along the way to pay for them?
Awesome. Well, Ben, thanks for being here. It's a great discussion. This might even be part 2 of 2. Like, this is a long discussion, and it's great. And thank you for what you do. I mean, between you and Antonio and maybe 2 or 3 others that I think I personally follow, but a lot of us follow in this space, like, you're definitely at the top of your game, and thankfully you're a pharmacist, and thankfully you're on our side in a lot of these issues and fighting the good fight. So we appreciate that.
Absolutely.
Thank you for having me. It was a pleasure, and look forward to the next conversation.
All right. Thanks, Ben. We'll see everybody on the next episode of Our Experience.